G'day there. Welcome to part 2 of Innovative Podcasting with your class. I'm Greg Curran. I'm a lecturer in teacher education, host of the podcast Pushing the Edge with Greg Curran, and an innovation coach that helps teachers just like you turn their ideas into initiatives that have real impact in their school. This webinar series is all about you and your students, creating a podcast that you're passionate about, a podcast that's got a bit of edge, a podcast that has listeners tuning in because they're genuinely interested in what you've created as a class. In this 3-part webinar series, we start by getting clear about the focus of your podcast. Then in part 2, this episode, we craft your goals and milestones. And in the final episode, we create a step-by-step action plan as well as a support system to keep you fired up and on track with your podcasting. So let's get started. Here's part 2. You'll get the most out of this episode if you've completed the tasks in part 1 of Innovative Podcasting with your class. Click the link at the top of this slide or go to pushingtheedge.org and click on webinar for part 1. Here's a recap. In part 1, we get clear about the focus of your podcast. First, we unpack your class's foundation for podcasting, zeroing in on your students' strengths and passions. Next, we identify the key challenges you want to meet. Then we brainstorm the possibilities for your podcast. And finally, we narrow down your ideas to one podcasting idea, which brings us to this episode, part 2. In this episode, we'll take your podcast idea and flesh it out. We'll develop clear, concrete goals. Then we'll identify key milestones to meet in your podcasting journey, so you're able to see how you and your class are progressing. And finally, we'll build in an accountability mechanism to challenge you and to keep you on track. Like part 1, we're going to work through some exercises, so grab a device to record your ideas on, or have some paper, pens, pencils, texters, and post-it notes handy. Here's your starting point for this episode. You need a description of your podcast idea, a brief sentence detailing your purpose for the podcast, and a short description of your audience or listeners. If you haven't completed this part yet, spend time on it now. Go to pushingtheedge.org and click on webinar for further information and support. Or you can click the link at the bottom of this screen to get started with part 1 in this webinar series. So what would you like to achieve through podcasting? Let's get started with your goals. Goals for you as the teacher, as well as goals for your students. Here I'd like to distinguish between 2 types of goals, transactional goals and transformational goals. Transactional goals, also known as performance goals, are about completing a specific task in the short term. In working towards a transactional goal, you're focused outward. Here's an example of a transactional goal for podcasting. I want to start podcasting with my students and produce 2 episodes a month. It's a pretty basic goal, right? So let's step it up a bit with transformational goals. Transformational goals are focused inward. They're about developing our knowledge, skills, or capacities so that we can navigate similar situations or problems in the future. They usually involve a series of interrelated tasks and generally take more time to achieve than transactional goals. Here's an example of a transformational goal. It has 3 key parts. Firstly, discovering what my students enjoy in respect to podcasting and are able to sustain. Secondly, improving their communicative skills. And finally, committing to podcasting over the longer term. So this transformational goal has more of an action research emphasis to it. It's about gathering information to enable you, the teacher, to create a podcasting program that has legs, that can be sustained, because it's built on the interests and passions of your students. It's not just about enjoyment though. We want to build students' communicative skills and see them commit to the podcasting process. Here's another transactional goal. Let's transform it and see the difference. So here's my goal transformed, and as you'll see, a much deeper level of knowledge and skills is called for. Here we're aiming to develop students' awareness of their podcast audience in terms of what interests and engages them. This will hopefully invite action research as students build connections with their audience, finding out what makes them tick, what they'd like to know or hear more about. There's so much potential for knowledge and skill development here, which could be applied well beyond the field of podcasting. With transformational goals, we're also focused on the long term. So students are required to apply what they've learnt about their audience's interests to the actual production of the show, and to do this on a regular basis. Again, there's potential for interaction that has a real-world purpose, as students investigate whether each episode actually interests their audience. One more example. With this transactional goal, the teacher wants their students to successfully perform a couple of podcasting roles, such as hosting and editing. So let's have a go at transforming this goal. If we transform this goal, it requires some investigation on the student's behalf. Firstly, finding out the key role requirements of 2 podcasting jobs. Then, identifying what success looks like in respect to these role requirements. So it's not just a matter of any old standard is okay, there's quality control here. Finally, we're also focused on sustainability and long-term knowledge and skill development, in terms of the students having to successfully meet these requirements on a regular basis. So over to you now. What do you want to achieve with your students, and what do you want to achieve personally? What are your transformational goals, and when do you want to achieve them by? A couple of tips here. You might find it easier, like I did, to start with a transactional goal, just to get a basic idea of the components of the goal. Then transform it, switching focus outward and long term, aiming to develop knowledge and skills that can be applied in similar situations in the future, or that can cross over into non-podcasting areas. A second tip, it can sometimes take a few drafts to get your goal on the mark and ready to go. Often we're too close to the issues, so ask someone else who's not involved to have a look. Hit pause now and come back when you've got your goals ready to go. Now that you've got your transformational goals already, let's do a check-in and see how they fit. We might need to make some changes to them. I want you to step into the future here. Imagine that you're successfully producing a podcast with your students, and you and your students are successfully meeting all the goals you've set. I'm going to give you some prompts now, and I want you to write or draw what comes to mind. Write or draw what you see or hear your students doing as they successfully podcast. You're successfully meeting the goals you set, so what's specifically working in your class? How have things shifted in your class? What's better or different from when you started this podcasting journey? What were the gaps back then, the challenges, the difficulties? How have things improved since? How have you diverged from your original path? What's different about your journey now? How are you engaging differently? As you step into the future where you're meeting all your goals and successfully podcasting, what are other people saying? What feedback are you getting from your audience? What are your colleagues or other members of your PLN saying about your podcasting initiative? If they were to observe both you and your students engaged in the podcasting process, what would they say? Now that you've reflected on your goals in the future, how do they stack up? Are any changes needed? Maybe you want to head down a different path with your podcast, so substantive changes are in order. Or maybe you're right on track, ready to go. Hit pause on the video and critically assess your goals one by one. So how's it going so far? Do you have any questions or any issues that you're not sure how to work through? Or perhaps you'd like some additional support. If so, drop me a line at greg@pushingtheedge.org or click on the coaching link for further information on my one-to-one coaching program. Now that you've firmed up your goals, let's identify your milestones. Imagine your podcasting journey as a timeline. At the very end, you're successfully meeting your goals, but that's a way down the track yet. How do you know you're progressing day to day and week to week? Let's identify the milestones, the accomplishments along the way, skill and knowledge-wise, that will take you and your students towards your end goals. I'm going to take you through a process now for identifying and crafting your milestones. Let's start with your end goal. What are the key aspects of this particular goal? We could possibly break this goal into two key aspects. Firstly, the art of podcasting, in terms of interesting and consistently engaging our audience. We could also consider goal achievement in respect to understanding plus application on a regular basis. So let's identify now the questions that come to mind in respect to the art of podcasting and goal achievement. Here's two questions that came to mind for me in terms of interest and engagement. I want to take these questions now and convert them into milestones. So, an early milestone might be able to identify and explain 3 aspects that make a podcast interesting. A later milestone, focusing on the real-world application of their knowledge, might be creates a podcast segment that addresses an audience interest and gains their engagement. Over to you now. Here's 2 more questions, this time focusing on process. How would you convert them into milestones? What would be your early milestones? What would be your middle of the journey milestones? Or a later milestone? And a key tip here, make sure you include milestones that require real-world demonstration through your podcast. So let's give it a go now with one of your goals. Firstly, identify the keywords in your goal. Then, brainstorm the key questions that come to mind. Go wild here, no limits on your thinking, and don't worry about getting your questions in order. You might want to use post-it notes so that you can move your ideas around. When you've identified your key questions, lay them down on a sheet of paper with 3 columns, just like you can see here. Work through each question, converting it to a milestone with a tentative date. Now keep this sheet handy because we'll use it to develop an action plan in the next episode. You've now identified your goals and milestones. Now let's turn to the resources that'll help you and your students meet your milestones and achieve your goals. Let's start with strengths and passions. Go back to your students' strengths and passions which we identified in our first webinar. How much you tap into and make use of their varied expertise and interests. How much you support your students to teach each other. And what about your strengths and passions? What might be useful in respect to podcasting? What about the expertise within your professional or personal learning community? Who do you know inside or outside your school that's already podcasting or creating media with their class? Perhaps reach out via social media or your social networks. Spread the word about what you're doing along with any questions you have. What books, videos, podcasts or other online resources do you already know of that could support you? Now a tip here, sometimes less can be more. Go with what you have and then investigate or reach out when you have specific questions. Otherwise you can end up feeling a little bit overwhelmed at all the possibilities. What tech do you have available right now for podcasting? You don't have to have the most expensive equipment, and there's many online tools available that are low cost or free. So what could you start with immediately, then add on to later once you know whether podcasting is going to be a viable initiative with your class? Are there any other resources that come to mind? Click the link on this page to sign up for my podcast resource file, which includes links to education podcast communities, as well as tips and insights and other resources to help you on your podcasting journey. You can also go to pushingtheedge.org and click on webinar. One other resource that cannot be underestimated is an accountability buddy. This is a person that you regularly meet up with to discuss your plans, the steps you've taken, the progress you've made, as well as the challenges you're navigating. Your accountability buddy's key role is to keep you accountable, ensuring that you stay focused and on track to meeting your milestones and your goals. They need to be okay challenging your procrastination. They have to be able to call out your avoidance strategies, and they must be consistent in their follow-up, making sure you do what you say you're going to do. Your accountability buddy also helps you recognise the wins along the way, like the shifts in your students' knowledge and skills. So who will you choose as your accountability buddy? Or perhaps your accountability team? How will you ask them? It might be useful here to script what you'll say. And when will you ask them? Set a firm date here. So here's where you should end up. A list of goals for your students and yourself, along with completion dates. A list of milestones for each goal, as well as completion dates. You should have also identified the resources you have available and potential accountability buddies, along with an idea of how you'll present the idea to them and when you'll do this. In the next Innovation Coaching by Example webinar, we'll explore your reality in relation to podcasting in your school. Where are you and your students at right now in relation to your goals? What are the challenges or obstacles, and how might you go about navigating them? We'll explore your options, and then we'll develop a step-by-step action plan to meet your podcasting milestones and goals. And finally, we'll recap and nail it down so you're all ready to go on your podcasting journey. So go to pushingtheedge.org and click on webinar to get started with part 3. Or you can click on the link at the top of this screen for episode 3. So you're all set now with your podcasting goals and milestones, but you might still have some questions. And if that's the case, feel free to drop me a line at greg@pushingtheedge.org. And if you'd like some additional support to get started podcasting, or to navigate the hurdles that often come up, or to take your podcasting to the next level, Click on the coaching link for further information on my one-to-one coaching program, or go to pushingtheedge.org and click on coaching. Now, if you found this webinar useful, don't be shy. Tell others about it. I'd really appreciate it. I'm Greg Curran. Thanks for watching, and whatever you do, keep pushing the edge.